Hello, students. Welcome back to live stream. All right. So today, we've got. Oh, hi, bud. Come here. Come here for a little bit. Okay. Hi, students. So today we're going to be going over, just like English, or just like we did for yesterday for English, I'm going to go over a few things for the IUE. And then in SI, I've assigned the group evaluations on Schoology, and so you're going to turn that in via turnitin.com by 11:59 tomorrow. Okay. Today on the live stream, I'll be going over content for the IUE, reviewing content for the IUE for English and for SI. I'll have slides up so that you can see what I'm discussing, and and while I'm on those slides, you can go ahead and ask questions in chat about what you should be doing for that section as I'm talking about it. I'll be going over transitions in English. I'll also be going over titles. Though, to be fair, you should already have an idea of what you'll be doing for those. And I think that's it. It's pretty much everything on my list for today. Okay. All right, folks. So, this is what your English section should look like. Many of you were asking questions yesterday as to what specifically should be going into each of the sections. As a quick review here, remember that we are starting with literature this time around in the IUE. The reason why we're starting with English is because it connects thematically, right, with what we're doing in our thesis and what we're trying to prove in our thesis. If you really think about the ways in which the concept of a single story ties into the thesis, I mean, first we're going to have to talk about what that is and define it, and talk about what are potential consequences of the single story. That's all section A. Section B would be going through the particular single story that is specific to Africa, and we're talking about the different mindsets that make up the narrow perspective of the continent, namely the romanticized and the imperialist mindsets, right? You're going to have to talk about both of those, talk through what that means, what both of those mindsets actually consist of, some examples as to what someone with those mindsets might say about the continent. And then in section B as well, you're going to introduce Le Blanc as a play that sort of contends, right, the single story, or contests rather the single story, and what you're doing there is again discussing a character who displays the romanticized or imperialist mindset. My preference, as I've talked about before, is that you talk through an imperialist mindset because in terms of proving the thesis and addressing section C in English, you're going to have a much easier time with the imperialist mindset, right? So you're talking through an example of the imperialist mindset as presented through one of the characters. There's a lot of characters to choose from. You can choose Marta, Charlie, Rice, to some extent Reverend Nielsen, but there are characters there that work better than others. Abiose could work too to some degree. And then finally, section C is when you're going to be balancing out that single story, talking through, well, what is it that, or which character actually challenges the contents of the single story as you've presented in B, right? And it's not enough, remember, to just talk about what is, or who the character is and what they did. You actually have to go through in what way it actually challenges the single story, meaning that you have to address the aspect of the single story that this actually challenges, right? So remember, we talked about it in the review, but it's not enough just to tell me that Shenbei challenges a single story because he refutes what Charlie says about blank. No, you actually have to go into, well, how does he refute it? How does what he's saying actually refute what Charlie says, right? How does it change the understanding of what's going on with the missions? How does it change the understanding of what's going on with notions of race and things like that? So you actually have to discuss. That's the analysis part. That's what you're actually doing the analysis of there. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and pause, and I'll go ahead and check back on the chat just so that we can see. Oh no. Nevada, good question. So you are asking about how to not say single story so many times, no repeating, not repeating single story. What I would do is think about synonyms, right? So when we think about the idea or the concept of a single story, what exactly is well, not just about the contents, but what are some ways that we can, what are some words that we can sort of use in its stead? You can talk about like narrow perspectives. You can talk about limited understanding. You could talk about closed-minded views, something like that. Hopefully, those will be some ways that you can, mention single story without repeating it over and over. Leela, I would not combine A and B. I would actually do A and B separately. So A should be a discussion of concept of a single story, and then B should be specific to Africa, and also you're talking through their character and an example from the play. So that's a lot of content for B, which should be separate from A. So I would definitely split those two up. And in fact, B could be 2 paragraphs if we're thinking through one, what Africa's single story is. In other words, explaining the content of the 2 mindsets. And then B in that section, same section, or 2, sorry, would be the character, an event, or scenario, scene from the play. Okay, I would not combine A and B. there's too much content there, I think, to combine them. Nicole, sorry I didn't answer earlier. Yeah, pretty much only English and SI. If you have questions about AR and ES, you should direct those towards your respective teachers. And still see whoever your science teacher is. Any other questions about English, the section 2? How should you start the English paragraph? You just get right into it, talking about the single story, because that's where your essay starts. You don't need to transition from your intro, so you should be okay. Melody. Yeah, so Ms. Edmond might have told you not to direct quote in terms of the English section, but did you hear that prior to the school closure information, or was it during? Like, was it yesterday that she told you not to do that? Because since you have all the information in front of you, I really don't see a problem with direct quoting. We're not going to take points off. So we're all on the same page in terms of we're not taking points off for not direct quoting, but I don't see why you wouldn't want to try and impress your teachers and directly quote and use citations like you've been taught, you know. The reason why we don't have direct quoting in the actual IUE when you're writing it is because, you know, there's no source in front of you that you can quote. But for now, because you have all the stuff in front of you, I would suggest doing it. So if it was on Friday that she told you that, then yeah, I would reconsider. Again, you're not getting points off. You're just, you know, adding on to your IUE. Think of it that way. Section B. Mia, so you are going to mention both singles. So it's not that you're mentioning two single stories. You're mentioning one single story. The content of that single story are those two mindsets, right? So it's thinking of the single story as remember, a single story is an unbalanced truth. It's a incomplete truth, right? And so the idea is it can be made up of a lot of different things, but in terms of the continent of Africa, what we see is that it's made up of these two mindsets, right? The imperialist mindset and the romanticized mindset. So section B, you mentioned both of those mindsets, but talk about how they're the content of a single story. Okay. So Sophia, that's the same question as what Mia's asking, I think. Basically, you are talking through both of the mindsets, but when you actually discuss a character and scene from the play, you're going to choose one character and one scene that the character is involved in, and that would be the one that you discuss and analyze. Okay, talking through like how what they said or did shows that mindset at work and how that mindset ultimately influences the way in which they choose to act or behave. So you're talking about both. So you're still talking through both of the mindsets, but you're only providing an example of one, is what you're doing in section B. Okay? Are there other questions for English? Ethan, no, it's not a requirement. Okay, any other questions for English? I'll be moving into transitions and then potential titles. So if you have questions, you can just continue asking them in chat. I'll take a look at it after I finish the slides, okay? All right. So as far as transitions go for the IUE, this is what we're looking at for the major transitions. Now remember, and I mention this every single time we do the IUE, but you still want to do transitions from paragraph to paragraph, regardless of whether it's from major section or curriculum to a different curriculum. That's just a facet of good writing, okay? But those transitions can come in the form of transitional phrases, right? So you can say something like continuing the discussion from blank, or adding on to, or contrasting with, or next. You can use transitional phrases as part of your transitioning from one paragraph to the next within the same major section, right? But the transitions from larger sections need to be transitional sentences, as we've worked through in class. Transitional sentences are usually compound sentences that have that connect the ideas from one paragraph to the next, right? And so for literature, you're going to want to for transition from literature to AR, we're thinking about what's the last thing you talked about in literature, and what's the first thing you're going to be talking about, or what's the thing you're going to be generally talking about in the AR section, and you're combining those two ideas. And so for literature, remember that the last thing you're ending with is a discussion of a challenge to the single story. And then in art and religion, which you'll be doing, is talking through the history of Islam's influence on African culture, right? And so you have to see what is the natural connection there, what is the academic connection that you can make between the content of what you finished in lit and what you're starting with in art and religion. I see a natural connection there. I want you to see if you can type it in the chat, and we'll talk through possible ones. Maybe that's the way that we'll do this, to make it a little bit more interactive, and to make to have a little more buy-in from your side, instead of me just giving you all the transitions, because that's not what class would have been like either, right? So AR to SI, thinking through the transitions there, the last thing, or the thing that you were talking about at the end of AR, is the ways in which African history was obscured, right? The things that impacted the way in which African culture was talked about, right? That's what you're ending with in AR. And then in SI, you're starting with a brief context of the second wave of imperialism and the scramble for Africa. So there is also a natural connection there, right? You can start putting in ideas for that into chat, and I'll look through them and talk through whether or not that would work, right? Social institutions to ES, I know this is within the same section, and so it might seem like you don't have to do a transitional sentence, but keep in mind that these are curriculum, these are separate curriculum, so please make sure that you do a major transition from SI to ES. In social institutions, you were just finished talking through the ways in which the colonial rule in Africa was oppressive, by using King Leopold's Ghost or the Belgian Congo as a case study, right? And so if you're ending with that discussion of building blocks and different ways in which the Belgian rule of the Congo was oppressive, you can talk through how that would connect to ideas in ES, where you're discussing how race was used to justify what the colonialists were doing in Africa, right? Another natural connection there. You can add that into the chat, and I'll look that over. And finally, in terms of the curriculum from ES to SI, in ES you're ending with a discussion of how race was used to justify the oppression, and then you're transitioning into SI. You're starting with the idea of a resistance strategy that was used to challenge notions of single story, right? Challenge apartheid policies in particular, which you'll be discussing through Steve Biko's Black Consciousness Movement. And then finally, you're transitioning from, and there needs to be a transition here, not like intro to first paragraph, right? There has to be a transition from SI to conclusion, and there's a very natural connection there, right? The SI talking through how Black consciousness is used to challenge a single story is the last thing you're talking about there, and then finally the first thing you're talking about in the conclusion is different ways in which the unit lessons helped you to challenge single stories that you've heard in your own life. So there's definitely natural crossover there and a good transition material there for you to use. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and switch back to the chat here so I can talk through potential questions. Ashley, the most recent question. I just want you to, you can try any transition. I'll basically be looking through it and saying like that would work, that wouldn't work, etc. So Muriel, a single story can be challenged through studying LeBlanc and its characters, and it can also be challenged through the study of Islam's effect on Africa. To some, you've got the concepts there. I would work on the phrasing a little bit, but when you say like it can be challenged through the study of Islam's effect on Africa, I think it's a little bit too vague. So maybe start going into like a specific way in which that story is challenged in the transition. That way you have something to latch onto in your paragraph. Preservation of Africa's history, counting. Nevada, yeah. So that would be, I think, a more specific way of phrasing Muriel's transition, talking specifically of how a single story is challenged by preserving Africa's history, which was done through influence or the Islamic influence. Yeah, that would work. Andres, we'll get into questions for SI in the second half of today, okay? So hold on to that question. Benjamin, there's no transitioning from the intro. You go straight into your discussion of the single story, okay? We'll go over titles after this, and so any discussion about titles, we'll keep to that. Transition, Toshi, yeah. Transitions come at the beginning of a new section. Remember, transitional sentences for major sections, but you should still be doing transitional phrases for transitions between regular paragraphs. Any more questions for transitions? Any more suggestions for transitions if you want to try them out? I'll basically hang around here for about 3 to 5 minutes looking through transitions if you want to post them up, and I'll talk through them. And then I'll transition into titles. Okay? Victoria, I was talking about that earlier. Major section to section, you need transitional sentences, meaning that you're transitioning from the last idea you talked about in the previous section and transitioning into the new idea that you're talking about in the paragraph that you'll be writing. So those are the ones that you would need. Transitional sentences are what you would need for major section transitions, but you still need transitional phrases if you're going from one paragraph to the next. So that could look like, next, or adding on, etc. Dominic, that would be too broad, I think. You're going to want to bring up more specific content. Yes, Nevada, absolutely. That's how I see that transition playing out, so that you're on the right track. Ashley, yeah, you're on the right track there. I would say that apartheid is absolutely an example of how race is used to justify what's going on there, right? In terms of informing the apartheid policies and being okay with those policies. Part of the justification is because of the that pseudoscientific notion of race. Absolutely. Melody, yeah. Yep. You're on the right track there. Um, Remember, think back to the lesson that we did on transitions. You're really looking for the connection between the ideas. What kind of a relationship do they share, right? Is this information that sort of expands on or adds on to the argument? Then you would use a particular transition, right? Is it one that contrasts with or gives a different perspective of something? Then you would give that particular transition. So you really have to sort of think about, is it sequential? Is it chronological? There are different relationships that these ideas from the paragraphs share, and so that's what you're really honing in on for your transitional sentences. Okay. Okay, so then I'm going to go ahead and talk through titles. It's going to be very quick. I don't really see this being long, and so let me just go ahead and quickly transition here. Oh. Donna, good question. When you're transitioning from ES to SI, I would basically say, whereas when you're doing the first transition, you're talking about in what ways that their rule was justified by race. In the second one, the the context is more in the frame of what needs to be resisted. And so if you're thinking about that last section of SI being about Black consciousness, you should be framing the transition to start talking through how, it was used as a justification for oppressive policies, but that these things could be challenged, right? These things could be contended with using Black consciousness as a resistance strategy. Ashley, I would say when you talk about King Leopold, you should be saying that this is happening specifically in the Belgian Congo. However, that these things can also be sort of extrapolated to see beyond just the Congo, because these things were being done elsewhere in Africa as well. Right? It's a case study, but it's specific to the Congo, but some of the elements of colonization are still the same. Right? And so you still want to address it specifically. Not required, Alondra. No. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and start going to titles. If you still have a question about transitions, you feel free to go ahead and post that in the chat, and I'll talk through it. But for now, titles. All right, so as far as titles go, basically it's the same stuff as before, right? It's a 2-tier title. So any of that single tier stuff on the left-hand side here, Unit 4 IUE Africa, IUE single story, etc., would not be okay, right? You want to have a 2-tier title. The first part of it being a usually you can use figurative language here, like destroying the monolith, right? You could talk through more of a clever way of looking at or using a metaphor for that first section of the title, and then in the second section of the title, that's what you're actually doing in the essay. It's the discussion of a thesis, right? So it could be like an analysis of the impacts of colonization in Africa. It could be studying the history of Africa, challenges, single story, something like that, right? So you have a lot of options here. It really just reflects your understanding of the essay. A good title is oftentimes an indicator of the fact that you know what you're talking about, because you're able to simplify what you're saying into just the title, right? And so being able to make that concise and clear gives me and the other teachers the understanding that you get what you're talking about. All right. And so that basically is it for as far as English goes for the review today. I don't really have any more for you in terms of content for English, and so I'll hang on here for another maybe 5 minutes, and you guys can talk through transitions, and I'll be here to provide some support. But we'll transition into SI at, let's say, 10:42, 10:45, something like that. All right. Molly, you are just writing in present tense for Le Blanc, because that's talking through literature. If you're talking about history and stuff, though, you can always talk in past tense because those things have happened, right? Ashley, that is what we're hearing as well. None of us know for sure what is happening. This is kind of unprecedented territory, and it's very interesting times. I don't really know what else to say besides that. We are, preparing for the worst, and this might be the new normal for the next few months. It might not be. It really just depends on how the containment goes. You know what I mean? And if it's the case that we are continuing to do this and we're going to be out longer, then I'm looking at ways that we can make things more interactive, looking at ways to make things more face-to-face, because I think just doing it through chat takes a lot away from the classroom. Yeah. All right, I'm going to take a bathroom break. I'll be back, so just keep typing in chat for questions, and I'll get to it when I get to it. Okay. Yeah, Molly, it's not that history doesn't have to be. History should not be in present tense. If you're talking through about a historical event or something that happened in the past, you should always have it past tense. Okay. Okay. If there's no other questions for English, I'm gonna go ahead and go into the SI section, much in the same way that I did the lit section. So I'll just talk through what you're doing for the major sections, and then you can ask me questions for discipline-specific questions in chat, and I'll go over them together with you. Okay. Um, so as far as SI is concerned, now that we've gone over Black consciousness, basically everybody has all the content they need in order to write out the sections. But to sort of review what you're doing, for social institutions for this particular IUE. We're going to take a look at section 4 first, which is talking through European colonialism. Now you got to think about that third map statement. What is it that you're actually discussing there? What is it that you're actually trying to prove? Well, you're attempting to prove that you can challenge the single story by getting an understanding of the colonial history of Africa, right? Remember that there's two components to that. In AR, you're discussing how there is a pre-colonial history that exists, and that challenges the notion that Africa didn't have a history prior to colonization, right? But you're also considering the fact that there are these particular elements of the single story that SI will challenge, right? The challenge being that colonization did not just bring modernization and industrialization and development, that it also handicapped, it also saddled the African countries that formed out of decolonization with economic debt, with dependency, right? So there's a lot of these lingering effects, the colonial legacy that's left over as a result of understanding, and you will only understand that impact of the colonial legacy if you have an understanding of colonial history, right? And so if we're looking at the context for European colonialism, what we want you to discuss here, we talked about, was the second wave of imperialism, which we want you to have dates for, the era, what period of time this was, who were some of the major players, and in particular, what were they after, right? And so we look at the motives for the scramble, let's just say scramble for Africa, not scramble of Africa. And what you're doing there is looking through and specifying two specific motives. And the two specific motives that we want you to talk about are the economic motives and the political motives, right? And so you're looking at the factors there. Economically speaking, what were some of the motivations that had Europeans go out to colonize Africa? We talked about resource exploitation, right, being one of the major ones. In particular because of what's going on in Britain at the time and elsewhere in Europe. We call it the Industrial Revolution. That married with capitalism, this new economic system, we see the potential for massive profit gain, right? And so in that potential for massive profit gain, there is the the desire for Europeans to see if they can cut costs where they can, and one of the best ways to cut costs is to just take resources for free. The idea being that if you can exploit these resources, create products out of them, and then sell them to the global market, you would make money, right? And the profit margins increase. And so economic motivations there, you have to discuss that. You also have to talk through the political motivation or factors, which, as we talked about earlier, was nationalism, right? Increasing notions of national power, national pride, right? Remember, in Europe, we see what's happening in Europe is that there's no more land left to conquer, and to conquer land in Europe would mean to go to war with any of the competing European nations. And so instead, they take this and so have a proxy imperial movement that happens in Africa, right? More land that you can get in Africa, more territory that you can gain in Africa means that you can sort of claim that as your own and show just how powerful you are as a nation, right? And so this is a way for countries to sort of show their power on a global scale, on a global level. And so that becomes one of the motivations too, right? And so in talking through that context, then you're saying that's section A. You're going to transition in section B for SI, which is looking specifically at one of the colonies that were established in Africa, that colony being the Belgian Congo. And for this particular section, what we wanted from you is to, number one, define oppression, what that is, right? Talk through the definition. You should know it word for word by now, right? What is oppression? And then through talking about specifics from King Leopold's Ghost, you are then proving to me, well, what about the colonial presence and policies in the Congo was oppressive? And in describing what's oppressive about these policies and practices, right, you're challenging the single story. What is it about them being oppressive that challenges the single story? So you're doing all of that in section B. Structurally, if you break it down, you do defining oppression and then talking through some of the building blocks. Remember, we wanted only 2 out of the 6, but there are definitely some that work better than others. And you have a lot of examples for particular ones from King Leopold's Ghost. From all 5 sections of your reading is fair game. And so, again, this is one of those sections where if you want to directly quote, you can. You don't have to. But if you want to provide direct quotations because you have them in front of you, you can. Citations would be the same as what you would normally do for an MLA citation, right? Hawks Guild and then the name, page number. The building blocks you can talk through. Remember, the 6 of them could be, grabbing land, raw deal, craft crash, drawing the line, holding up hierarchies, and finally, West is best. There are some that work better than others, and there are some that work better as transitions from B to C. So you really want to think about what you're setting up for C, right? C is talking through race as justification for oppression. So there are certain ones, hint 5 or 6, that actually transition better into C as after you talk about it in B. So that's something that you should keep in mind as you're writing out this section. Okay. I want to go ahead and transition to, or switch out of this and go into the chat. So if you have questions, I'll go through it. Melody, yes. You are using the same words when you define oppression. Everybody should be using the same definition. Absolutely. Yeah, Ashley. Your historical analysis is going to give you a lot of good information for this, but remember, the additional thing here is that you are not just telling me what makes colonialism oppressive. You're talking through, well, in understanding what makes it oppressive, how does it actually challenge a single story or the single story? And so this is where you have to connect to the thesis, right? So you're looking through characteristics of oppression, but talking about then how it connects, or talking about how it challenges a single story. So when you say things like craft crash is oppressive because it prevents development in Africa, it restricts them from being able to industrialize on their own, makes them more economically dependent on their mother country, et cetera, et cetera. In the historical analysis, it was enough just to say that and be like, so see, that's a part of what makes it oppressive, is that it has these restrictive elements, it has these pervasive elements to it. But now, in addition to that, you're discussing then in understanding what that did to these African colonies, when they become countries, how does it ultimately impact them? Right? What was the leftover impact? What was the colonial legacy? And then how does that challenge then the single story that exists? Right? We talk about economic failures, and we talk about poverty, and we talk about political instability. Right? Are these things that are just endemic to Africa then? Is it something that just is there, right, because the people are that way? Or is it something that is a leftover of colonial legacy? So that's what you have to discuss there to say that it challenges a single story. Right? Nevada, yes, you are picking 2, and that's pretty much it. Any more questions for that first section of SI? Yes, that is part of the definition. Absolutely. Donna, yeah. Um, Leela, for the first part, if you're talking about second wave of imperialism and the scramble for Africa, no, that's not two separate paragraphs. You can put that into the same paragraph. Okay. Um, Andres, no, you don't have to introduce the author in King Leopold's Ghost. We know what source you're using in that section, and so you should be okay. After talking about oppression, you do want to maybe specify that you're going to be talking through the colonization of the Belgian Congo as a specific example of how colonialism was oppressive, and in understanding that, you can understand how it challenges a single story. Ben. Do what you need to do, man. If you want to talk through multiple building blocks in terms of talking through, like, grabbing the land, craft, crash, raw deal, all sort of like work in conjunction. You know what I mean? And so if you want to talk about multiple building blocks or multiple oppressive characteristics, and you're using multiple building blocks in the same discussion, and you think that's a better way of understanding that particular element of what makes it oppressive and therefore how it challenges a single story, then go for it. I wouldn't tell you not to write about something that you feel like you could explain better by talking about multiple building blocks for. Ashley, no. So you don't say in King Leopold's Ghost, you would say like in terms of the colonization of the Belgian Congo. Now, you can mention, like, if you want to do a sentence that says like King Leopold's Ghost by Adam Hawksfield demonstrates how blah 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 blah, you can say that sentence, but that's the extent to which I would mention the title of the book. We're really looking at the examples that he gives and the specific interviews, the specific letters and things like that he references. That's what we want to pay most close attention to from there. Yeah, Dominic, I would. So in addition to discussing what makes that building block oppressive, you also must discuss in what way then does it challenge the single story. Yeah. Any more questions for SI? Yes, Andres. That's part of the definition. Okay. If that's it for this section, I'll talk through the last section, and then we're basically done with the lecture component for today. Okay. The last section that you'll be responsible for in the SI is the Black Consciousness section. We talked through this a couple of days ago, and so for a lot of us, it should be fresh. You can always refer back to the lecture if you need to. In terms of context for this section, what you just need to provide is, who was responsible for this movement, and what wasn't in response to, right? So you're discussing some of the oppressive policies that were implemented during the time of apartheid. We don't need we don't need a super long discussion here. What we want here is instead sort of paint us a picture of what apartheid life was like, right? So you're looking at what were some of the established policies and practices that were oppressive. What were some of the things that those segregation policies did to the black population in South Africa, right? And so you're specifically talking about examples of different policies and practices there. And then in B, you're talking through, okay, so in A, you're talking through, so then why, given these policies, did Biko start this movement, right? And then in B, you're talking through, well, number one, what is black consciousness? Talking through those components, right? Those 5 components. I was mentioning to my previous classes that a lot of them are tied together, right? So when we talk about like agency, for instance, and development of identity, we talk about how these two are connected, right? You can't have a sense of empowerment and a sense of being able to actually have voice and act and create change in the society without having a common identity that you can be sort of proud of, right? So those are combined. You would talk about them in conjunction with one another, right? So these 5 components really do go together, and so you're talking through what the Black consciousness movement was setting out to do for the Black South African population in response to the apartheid policies. And then you're talking through, well, in what way does Black consciousness actually challenge the single story? How can it be used then to address problems with the single story? How can it be used to how can it be used to address what people were being, or what Black South Africans were being taught in schools then? How can it be used to challenge stories about South Africa now, right? Present day South Africa, thinking about some of the wealth inequality that still exists. How can we challenge a single story of maybe like Black South Africans just being lazy or can't get it together? How does the Black consciousness, allow us to challenge these notions? That's what you're discussing in that last section. And this is where you're really tying home or making a connection to the thesis statement, right? Talking through how, this education is used to undo or to challenge some of those perspectives we might have had earlier on about South Africa. And this is where you'd be fleshing out that discussion. I'm going to go ahead and transition back into chat here. All right, let's see. Ashley, you're talking about agency. Maybe I answered it during the thing, but agency just means like that you feel like you have the power to do something. Being an agent means being an actor, right? Having the potential to act. And so what it talks about agency for Black population, it means like that they have the ability to create change in society. That they're not just, targets, right? That they can be agents. Ben, I wouldn't go over too many of the laws. I would talk maybe about banning. I would talk maybe about passbooks, some of the more broad, general apartheid policies that made life in South Africa oppressive for Black South Africans. But yeah. Ashley, yeah, so if there's questions, maybe look at the video that she posted. Yeah, Josh, 5 components are focus on education, the focus on psychological liberation, There's a focus on development of identity, focus on agency of the black population, and finally, the focus on race as a socio-political construct. B could be 2 paragraphs, Mateo. Yeah, I see it being 2. You can do it in 2. Steve B, go first. Donna, Steve B, go first. Steve Biko in conjunction with black consciousness. So I would actually start that section with discussing some of the apartheid policies, because it actually transitions nicely from the previous section, right? And then you talk about who Stephen Biko was and why he created this movement in response to those policies. And Dominic, no, you don't talk about any of the other resistance strategies. Ashley, if you're talking about section B, which is like what is black consciousness and how those two things are connected. Basically, if you describe what black consciousness is in and of itself, you don't actually talk through how it challenges a single story, right? So you're just talking about, it focuses on education, it focuses on this. But that second question of how does it help to challenge a single story is the analysis part. So you can think of it like, if we talk about it in terms of English, you can think of it as like the scene that you're describing and that you're explaining, and then the part where you have to analyze it is secondary, or is the next component. You have to talk about specifically in what ways does it challenge single story. So you have to then address what are some of the single story concepts that it challenges, right? You can do all that combined if you wanted to. You don't have to separate it into like, what is black consciousness and then how does it challenge. You can do it as you're talking through the description of what it is. And if that's more natural for you, then you can do it that way. It's really just how you want to organize it as a writer. Black consciousness. I don't understand that. Nicole, if you look at the notes, and I actually posted a lecture on Monday for black consciousness for this side, my current side, that might be helpful for you. If you for some reason you don't have your notes, or for some reason you don't remember from last side what we talked about. But in talking through the different focuses of black consciousness, each of them lend themselves well to how it would challenge single story. So for instance, the last focus on race as a socio-political construct, right? So if we're looking at that specific idea in black consciousness, it challenges the single story because it's saying that the labels that we attach to black, right, for instance, are actually a result of a colonial legacy. It's not that they're inherently savage. It's not that they're inherently prone to war. It's not that they're inherently prone to instability. It's that these are the things that were taught about them because much of their history was erased. Much of their history is not talked about. Much of their history is covered over, right? And that the colonial history becomes the only history, right? And so when you're talking about how does black consciousness then challenge that, you're saying, well, in saying that race is a socio-political construct, it's addressing the fact that it was something created in order to divide. It's not something that they are inherently less than because of this color of their skin. It's that there were particular labels attached to them during colonization, right? During slave trade, etc., that actually made it so that these things were associated with the color of their skin. Biological construct, right? You talk about focus on education. You think about the ways in which their education was limited in their particular society, right? You're saying that the Bantu Education Act made it so that people were being taught only in particular trade professions, that they weren't able to access higher education. Their history wasn't being taught. Their culture wasn't being taught. Their language wasn't being taught. And that is a restriction of their rights and freedoms, right? And so you would say that understanding that, and in understanding how they were restricted in that way, you would say that Black consciousness draws attention to that, right? And saying that there needs to be that there needs to be a conscious effort on the part of the Black community to reclaim history, to reclaim culture, etc. So Nicole, those are for instance two different ways to talk about the two separate focuses, right, as it relates to challenging single story. Really, the way that I would simplify that discussion is what is the component of the single story that is being challenged by what Biko is saying about Black consciousness? And then you would talk about, so what does he say about Black consciousness that actually challenges that single story? That's the easiest way to organize that information. Any other questions for SI? Okay. If there are no other questions, then I'm done. Those of you on my current side for SI, I've gone ahead and posted the group evaluation assignment on Turnitin.com. So make sure that you submit your group evals on Turnitin.com. The format I posted on Schoology as part of the updates, so you can just check that to see how I want that formatted. But you have until 11:59 p.m. tomorrow for the group eval, so please make sure that you submit it by then. I will probably be on tomorrow around the same time. We're going to basically be talking about the same thing. From this point forward, we are not going to be, there's no lecture that's assigned. Nicole, yes. Melody, stop. Let me see. I might go live later today. Well, we'll see. Just keep an eye posted on Schoology. Keep an eye posted on YouTube. If you haven't subscribed, subscribe to it. um, so that you get notifications when I go on. Oh, Ashley, are we gonna ever talk about TRC? We can. What do you want to talk about? That a good question. It it was restorative. I don't know to what extent. We got to think about, if we think about like why TRC, instead of something like the Nuremberg trials, right? You got to sort of think about the context of South Africa being different from Germany. When we look at what's going to happen for South Africa afterward, what they were trying to do was find a way to not have this turn into a civil war. And so they were looking for ways to bring the black and white community together, which, you know, is a very difficult thing to do, specifically especially after like 40 or 50 years of apartheid policy or segregation policy. So was it justice? In some way, maybe it's not the justice that we're used to and that we want to say actually deals with the problem. But for a lot of people that didn't know what was going on during that time period, like where their family member went during the disappearances, or like what happened to them in the jails, or things of that nature, a lot of that information came out as a result of the commission, right? Giving people the possibility of acquittal made it more likely that a lot of them were going to come out and say something. You got to keep in mind too that only 12% of people were acquitted as a result of the trials, and so it's not like all of them were given, all of them weren't charged. I think the bigger problem is that a lot of people just waited out the commission. A lot of the people that committed crimes while apartheid was going on were able to sort of get away with it, in that they just waited the commission out and didn't say anything, and then, nothing ever happened to them because they never said anything on TV. So I don't know. I think it's a difficult question. That's why I asked it on the discussion board. It's a question with a lot of different possible responsive. I think we're more used to, in the American penal system, retributive justice, right? You do a crime, you do the time, you do punishment, right? But I think the context is slightly different, that might end up creating, I wouldn't say more problems, but I think it creates a different sort of problem if you just, jail all the white population for taking part in the apartheid policies, because you still have to live together. I don't know. No, you don't have to mention the other resistance strategies. Just black consciousness. Any other questions for SI? etc. By the way, if you know of any people that are not watching these, that are not logging in pretty regularly, please let them know that this is happening, because if we are out for longer, then more people are going to need to tune in. Currently, I only have about maybe 30 viewers at a time, which is only about a third of my classes, or less than that if you're counting SI and English. So if you know of people that don't know of this, please make sure that they know so they can log in and actually participate in class. All right. I will see you all tomorrow. If you have questions, you can still email me, etc. You can hold on to them for tomorrow if you want to. But that's it for me. Bye-bye.